The old saying goes that people remember the victors, and although that's true, that doesn't mean we can't go back and look at those who came up just short. This video looks at NFL dynasties that never were in the Super Bowl era, starting with the 1970s. The actual dynasty of the 1970s was the Pittsburgh Steelers, who won 4 Super Bowls and made 6 conference championship games in an 8-year span from 1972 to 1979. But they had to fend off several other teams for that crown, most notably the first entrant on our list, the 1970s Dallas Cowboys. America's team led the decade in regular season wins and winning percentage. They won 2 Super Bowls and appeared in 5. They made 7 conference championship games and missed the playoffs only once. The only thing preventing them from ruling the decade was their 3 Super Bowl losses, in particular their 2 Super Bowl losses to Pittsburgh, which were by a combined 8 points. If not for a couple of possessions in those 2 games, it would be the Steelers in this spot instead. The 1970s Raiders. Whereas the Cowboys were the Steelers' biggest threat in the NFC, the 70s Raiders were their biggest rival in their own conference. In an 8-year span from 1970 to 1977, the Raiders won a Super Bowl but lost 5 conference championship games. The Raiders went 2-3 against Pittsburgh in the playoffs during the decade, and despite many deep playoff runs and classic moments, it's tough to argue that they underachieved with just a single Super Bowl appearance. The 1970s Dolphins. Although the Dolphins' success in the 70s dried up after 1974, they make this list for the fact that they are realistically the closest any team has ever come to three-peating in the Super Bowl era. Everybody remembers the infamous undefeated 1972 squad and the 1973 squad that repeated as back-to-back Super Bowl champs. But many forget they made the Super Bowl in 1971 as well, which they lost handily to the Cowboys. The 1970s Vikings. Whereas the first 3 entrants on this list all brought home at least one title during the 1970s, the Vikings came up empty-handed. That's not to say they weren't close though. The main reason they make this list is due to 3 Super Bowls in a 4-year span from 1973 to 1976, although they would lose all 3 in decisive fashion. They made the playoffs 8 times in the decade and were consistently competitive due to their infamous Purple People Eaters defenses, but they were never able to seal the deal. The 1980s. It seems strange now since we all know the 49ers were the dynasty of the 80s, but up until as recently as 1988, that label was up for grabs because of this team, the 1980s Redskins. As mentioned before, heading into the 1988 season, the Redskins had as many titles as the 49ers, 2, and more Super Bowl appearances, 3, in the decade, but the team missed the playoffs the last 2 years of the decade while the 49ers added 2 more Lombardis, ending the debate decisively. Washington had the 2nd highest winning percentage in the decade behind San Francisco and also made a 4th NFC Championship game in 1986. The 1980s Bears. We all remember the infamous 1985 Super Bowl champion Bears, who dominated the league to a tune of an 18-1 record. But it begs the question, why did such a dominant team like that only make 1 Super Bowl in the decade? The Bears' title window was from 1984 to 1988, in which they made 3 conference championship games and led the NFL in winning percentage at 79%. They had a historically dominant defense, but outside of 1985, they were never able to complement it with even adequate quarterback play. If I was a Bears fan, I would be super pissed that they didn't reel off 3 or 4 titles in the decade. The 80s Broncos. The 1980s Denver Broncos are known today as a one-man band, of course referring to John Elway, who led the team to 3 Super Bowl appearances in a 4-year span from 1986 to 1989. While calling Elway the only reason Denver made those Super Bowls is a little insulting to the good defenses he had in 1987 and 1989, they most likely don't get there without him. Of course, in all 3 of those Super Bowl appearances, the Broncos had illegal things done to them and lost all 3 in decisive fashion. Still, making 3 Super Bowls in 4 years is a hell of an accomplishment. The 1990s. The 90s were the first full decade in the Super Bowl era without a 4-time Super Bowl winner. Because of this, the Dallas Cowboys took home the title of Dynasty of the decade with 3 Super Bowls. But there were plenty of potential dynasties that never got off the ground. The 90s Bills. The most obvious choice imaginable, as the 1990 to 1993 Bills remain the only team in the Super Bowl era to make the Super Bowl 4 straight years. If you know anything about NFL history though, you know they came up short with 0 titles. But the Bills remained consistently competitive throughout the entire decade, making the playoffs 8 times and finishing with the 3rd highest win-loss percentage. Still, most people will never be able to look past their dreadful Super Bowl performances. The 90s 49ers. The 49ers dynasty from the 80s continued into the 90s, in the regular season at least. The 49ers remained a machine from September to December, winning 71% of their regular season games to lead the decade in win-loss percentage once again. Of course, the 90s 49ers would not be as successful as their 80s counterparts in the playoffs, however. The 49ers did bring home a 5th Super Bowl title in in 1994, but the rest of the decade was filled with playoff disappointment. They lost 4 NFC Championship games, 3 of which were at home, despite having a first-ballot Hall of Fame quarterback under center each time. The 90s Packers. The Packers made the playoffs 6 straight years from 1993 to 1998, but their real title window was from 1995 to 1997, during which time they led the NFL in win-loss percentage, employed a QB in Brett Favre who won MVP each year, made the NFC Championship game each year, 2 Super Bowl appearances, and a Super Bowl championship in 1996. They had a 3-point fourth quarter lead in the 1995 NFC Championship game and the ball with the score tied at 24 in the fourth quarter of Super Bowl 32, but couldn't close the deal either time. They should have won 2 rings at least. The 2000s. The 2000s obviously belonged to the New England Patriots, led by their head coach Bill Belichick. They brought home 3 titles from 2001 to 2004 and came oh so close to adding a 4th, as well as an undefeated season in 2007. But as with each decade, there were plenty of teams who came up just short as well. The 2000s Colts. Surprisingly, it was the Colts, not the Patriots, who had the highest win-loss percentage in the 2000s. The team was led by Hall of Fame quarterback Peyton Manning and made the playoffs 9 times in the decade. The team won at least 12 games every year for 7 straight seasons. They won a Super Bowl in 2006 and made a second in 2009, but the Manning-era Colts will always be more remembered for their unfortunate playoff letdowns, most notably in 2005 versus the Steelers. The 2000s Steelers. If there was one team in the 2000s whose success depended more on the Patriots, it was Pittsburgh. They won 2 Super Bowls in 2005 and 2008, but they didn't have to play New England either time. In addition to those 2 Super Bowls, they also had the AFC Championship game at home in both 2001 and 2004, but lost each time to the Patriots. If not for New England, the 2000 Steelers might have replicated their dynastic run from the 1970s. The 2000s Eagles. The 2000s Eagles made the playoffs 8 times, but the heart of their title window was from 2001 to 2004, when they made 4 straight NFC Championship games and a Super Bowl. Unfortunately, as an Eagles fan, the team went just 1-4 in the NFC Championship game, and when they did get to the big stage in 2004, they puked all over themselves, literally, committing 4 turnovers in a winnable game versus the Patriots. The home NFC Championship game losses to Tampa Bay and Carolina in 2002 and 2003 stung the most, but don't overlook the team coming back from a 24-6 deficit to take a fourth quarter lead in the 2008 NFC Championship game just to lose 32-25. I'm gonna inject a marijuana now. The 2010s. Unfortunately, much like the 2000s, it was the Patriots who came out on top with 3 Super Bowl rings in the 2010s. They won an astounding 78% of their games during the decade, dwarfing the next best team, which also happens to be the first team from the 2010s to make my list. The 2010s Packers. The Cheeseheads started off the decade with a Super Bowl win over Pittsburgh, and with superstar and future Hall of Fame quarterback Aaron Rodgers entering his prime, it looked as though the team was destined for multiple rings. Safe to say, though, that obviously hasn't happened. Not that the team wasn't successful. After all, they made the playoffs 8 times, including each of the first 7 years of the decade. They made 4 NFC Championship games, but lost the last 3, including a heartbreaker in Seattle in 2014. Thanks to poor defenses and bad coaching, the prime years of the most talented quarterback in NFL history were largely wasted. The 2010 Seahawks. The 2010 Seahawks and Packers had very similar decades. They both won a Super Bowl early on with a young, budding Hall of Fame quarterback. Both made the playoffs 8 times and remained consistent contenders the entire time. The difference comes back to the 2014 NFC Championship game, in which Seattle won over Green Bay to give them a second Super Bowl appearance the Packers failed to achieve. The Seahawks came agonizingly close to repeating as champs, but they blew a 10-point fourth quarter lead before Tom Brady willed Russell Wilson to throw a goal line interception to Malcolm Butler with 20 seconds left. The 2010s Broncos. Alright, so the Broncos make this list because of the Peyton Manning years from 2012 to 2015, in which time they led the league in win-loss percentage and won 12 games every year. They made 2 Super Bowl appearances, the first in 2013 due to their historically great offense, and in 2015 thanks to their historically great defense. As we all know, they got the shit kicked out of them in 2013, but were able to win it all in 2015. The most overlooked year in the Manning era, though, is 2012, which might have been the most complete team of the bunch. If not for Raheem Moore, they probably would have won it all.